It never entered my mind even then, as the bombs rained down, that we would lose. Those were the words of Armin Lehmann, a passionate 16-year-old member of the Hitler Youth who had been transferred to Berlin in early April 1945, along with hundreds of other youngsters, to defend the city against the swiftly approaching Red Army. Lehmann was recruited as a courier, relaying signals from the Reich Chancellery's radio room to and from the dwindling figure of Adolf Hitler. A light of hope came for the Nazis when President Franklin D. Roosevelt died on April 12, 1945, at his residence in Warm Springs, Georgia. The German authorities rejoiced upon receiving the news, with Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's close aide, remarking, "This is the turning moment." The next day, Hitler was believed to have reassured his country's devastated troops on the Eastern Front that assistance was on the way. He told them that Berlin would stay German, and Vienna, which the Russians had only taken the day before, would soon be a part of the fatherland again. But things did not go according to his plans. Before we go into how he spent his hours, here's a quick reminder that subscribing is free. In reality, however, this highlighted the illusion with which the Nazi high leadership continued to hold the war effort. Indeed, in the last 24 hours, American soldiers had seized 2 heavy water piles at Stadtlim on the River Ilm, eliminating any possibility of the Germans producing an atomic weapon in the next months. The German army launched a counterattack against the Americans at Uelzen 2 days later, on April 15, in an attempt to connect up with their colleagues in the struggle for Berlin. The mission failed, and the Americans, codenamed Operation Kaput, defeated Hitler's troops with a deadly combination of artillery, tanks, and phosphorus munitions. The end of World War II was approaching, and thus the last days of the Nazis started. The word was conveyed in no clear terms the very following day, the 16th of April, 1945. The Soviets launched their onslaught against Berlin at 3 a.m. with 20 armies, 2.5 million men, and 40,000 mortars and field guns. Hitler was in a desperate situation, and now, at long last, he realized his time was up. The attack was received with a sense of hopelessness within the Führer's headquarters, an underground bunker built 50 feet beneath the Reich Chancellery. The bunker, which was made up of 2 interconnected shelters, was built in phases between 1936 and 1944. On January 16, 1945, Hitler moved into the underground bunker with his long-term companion, Eva Braun, and other staff members. In Hitler's magnificent private rooms, expensive carpets and rugs filled the flooring, while artwork stolen from the Chancellery adorned the walls. One of Hitler's favorite paintings, which depicted Frederick the Great, hung on the wall over his desk in one of the beautiful private quarters. Hitler would stay in the bunker for a total of 105 days. As the Red Army drew in on his government, life in the Chancellery and the bunker devolved into inebriation and depravity. There was nothing that could be done to stop the Soviet advance, and so it was on the 20th of April, 4 days later, that the leaders of Hitler's administration gathered for the last time. The room was filled with bare light bulbs, the water supply was running out, and the foul stench of human waste. Hitler's birthday had arrived. The party was shifted from the bunker to the bigger chambers of the new Reich Chancellery, where the majority of the visitors were eager for the event to conclude. Indeed, the Red Army was closing in on Berlin, and escape routes were closing by the hour. Nonetheless, Hitler looked determined to prolong the event. He even came out into the open to cheer and beautify a group of battle-worn troops and Hitler Youth members. He exclaimed "Heil Juch" with all his might. Except for the distant rumble of artillery, there was no reaction. It should be remembered, however, that Hitler's sluggishness was not abnormal. In truth, he wasn't in good health. His pasty skin was now paired with swollen features. His bloodshot eyes were burdened down by heavy bags, and his shaky stance and constant quivering of his left hand nearly gave the sense that his flaws were for show. Indeed, research has found that he was most likely suffering from Parkinson's disease. A report reached Hitler the next morning, on the 21st of April, informing him that Russian artillery was currently firing into the center of Berlin. Hitler's reaction was typical of the days leading up to it. He put the responsibility for Nazi failures completely at the feet of his cowardly generals. Even though everything had been destined to happen, Hitler was still unable to believe the Red Army had come so quickly. He regularly felt enraged, saying that he had been deceived by people in whom he had put his faith. Heinrich Himmler's attempt on the 22nd of April to negotiate Germany's conditions of capitulation with the Western Allies, excluding Russia, was the first case of betrayal, and it was unsuccessful. The second happened on the 23rd, when Hermann Göring, Hitler's commander of the Luftwaffe, wrote a telegram to his Führer recommending that he seize full leadership of Germany. "I shall take it for given that you have lost your freedom of action if no response is received by 10 o'clock tonight," Göring continued. A furious Hitler promptly fired his former confidant and arrested him on charges of high treason. Hitler also ordered the arrest of General Karl Wilding, commander of the Panzer Corps, 2 days later on the 25th. Wilding, accused of desertion, was fighting on the outskirts of Berlin. After being summoned to the bunker, Wilding quickly protested his innocence, leading to his appointment as battle commandant of Berlin. It was all evidence, if evidence were needed, that by late April, Hitler's thought process was as confused and chaotic as Berlin itself. Each morning, improvised units were dispatched to reinforce street barricades and trenches or to construct shelters. Fires raged and factories, workshops, and other businesses were forced to close. Using electricity was prohibited, and violators were sentenced to death. People were also talking about effective suicide techniques. Unsurprisingly, this talk was not limited to the general public. Inside Hitler's bunker, the Führer appeared strangely calm and melancholy, speaking of death as a release. All hope had vanished, and as a result of the perceived betrayal by both Göring and Himmler, Hitler's world, vision, and dream perished, along with the soldiers he continued to command into futile and hopeless battles. The alleged betrayals, as well as the overall hopelessness of the situation, convinced Hitler once and for all that he needed to end things. Hitler married his long-term mistress, Eva Braun, and they remained a couple for about 40 hours in a hastily prepared ceremony in a small map room, witnessed by Goebbels, head of the party chancellery, and Martin Bormann, Hitler's private secretary. Hitler's last days were approaching. On the 29th of April, with the Russians only 24 hours away from the total takeover of Berlin, Hitler ordered the poisoning of his German shepherd Blondie. The fear of his beloved animal falling into Russian hands was agonizing, but it was also needed to test the efficiency of the cyanide pills distributed around the bunker. Blondie passed away as soon as she had consumed it. Her 5 puppies were all shot as well. Artillery fire awoke the bunker inhabitants around 5 a.m. on April 30th. Hitler, who was seated bleary-eyed in a dressing robe and slippers, was notified within an hour that they were only a few hours away from defeat. Hitler ate his final lunch around 2 p.m. "The moment has come," he remarked as he stood up, "and it's all over." Goebbels, who had long insisted on Hitler remaining in Berlin, now attempted to persuade him to leave the city. Hitler declined and wished him farewell. More goodbyes were exchanged before Hitler retired to his quarters. He entered the big meeting room a while later, wearing a military jacket and his Iron Cross. Braun stood by his side. A congregation had assembled, and Hitler spoke a few words with them. Magda Goebbels begged him to leave the city, but her Führer refused. This rebuttal, along with her unwillingness to abandon Hitler, assured that the wife of the Nazi propaganda minister would soon write her chapter in the regime's heinous history. But for the time being, only Hitler and Braun had retired to his room. At this time, many reports have been given, but the general belief is that there was one shot fired at 3:30 in the morning of April 30th. Soon after, Hitler's assistant, Heinz Linge, entered the chamber and smelled strong gunpowder, smoke, and bitter almonds, often come where cyanide had been used. Bormann and Otto Günsche, a major in the SS, also entered. Hitler was found slumped on his sofa, his eyes open, and a coin-sized wound in his right temple. His cheek was dripping with blood, and there was a Walter handgun lying on the ground nearby. Eva Braun was sitting next to him. Her knees were pushed against her chest, and her lips were squeezed closely together as she wore a blue dress. Her unfired revolver was laying on the table in front of them. It is now believed that Hitler bit into a cyanide capsule at the same time he fired the gun. It's also been speculated that he shot himself in the mouth. According to one report, he drank the poison before a third person, acting on orders, shot him. We may never know without a reasonable doubt how Adolf Hitler died. But one thing is certain. Hitler and Braun, soon after, their remains were hauled up the steps to a tiny garden outside the bunker complex's door. One of those interrogated, Hitler's driver, assisted in carrying Eva's body part of the way, and that once there, it was laid on the ground next to Hitler's. He told his interrogators that he saw she was wearing a blue summer dress made of real silk, cork heels on her shoes, and that her hair was artificially blonde. Moments later, the same witness noticed a group of people assemble around the dead, including Goebbels and Bormann. One of them sprayed the victims with gasoline from a can. They then retreated to the shelter of a doorway, besieged by Russian gunfire. Hitler's adjutant ignited a petrol-soaked cloth and tossed it on the bodies, which erupted into flames. The group left after doing the Hitlergruß, the Nazi salute. One of the bunker guards came later than expected. During his interrogation, he recounted how he was taken aback when the two bodies erupted into flames, as though by spontaneous combustion. He had been unable to see the Goebbels party, which was hidden in a doorway, and was only later informed of the exact facts. The fire only partially incinerated the victims, which were then hurriedly buried in a small bomb crater. According to Russian claims, the remains were unearthed by Soviet soldiers and transferred to Magdeburg in East Germany, where Hitler's body was eventually incinerated by the KGB in April of 1970. A jawbone and a skull were preserved. In April 2000, they were put on display at the Russian Federal Archives in Moscow. Unfortunately, Adolf Hitler's death did little to stop more horror. Magda Goebbels put her 6 children to bed on May 1st after giving them sleeping pills and maybe morphine. Then, with the help of a doctor, she injected hydrogen cyanide drops down their throats. Only the eldest, 12-year-old Helga, fought back and survived to tell the story. Later that day, both Joseph and Magda Goebbels committed suicide. On the 8th of May, in the last days of the Third Reich, Germany surrendered unconditionally. Hitler's 1,000-year Reich lasted just 13 years, the final 6 of which witnessed a massive loss of life. September 2, 1945, the date commonly seen as the day that marked the official and definitive end of the Second Global War. Yet hostilities continued for several years beyond that date in many regions of the world. That's because the horrors of the war were so extensive and drew soldiers from all over the globe, it did not finish all at once in every region, as it was fought on such a massive scale. Instead, it ended in phases. 6 years and 1 day after Germany invaded Poland on September 1, 1939, the war as a whole came to a conclusion, not mentioning the Cold War. World War II cost the lives of an estimated 60 to 80 million people, or about 3% of the world's population by the time it ended. The worst conflict in human history claimed the lives of the overwhelming bulk of innocent people, including 6 million Jews who were murdered in concentration camps run by the Nazis during the Holocaust. In the early months of World War II, Germany used its Blitzkrieg, German for lightning war, which resulted in the country's rapid conquest of the Netherlands, Belgium, and France. And over 300,000 British and other Allied forces were forced to flee continental Europe from Dunkirk. Adolf Hitler, the ruler of Germany, violated the non-aggression treaty he had with the Soviet Union in June of 1941 and began Operation Barbarossa, which eventually pushed Nazi soldiers to the outskirts of Moscow. German troops had controlled a large portion of Europe, and their territory extended from the Black Sea to the English Channel by the time the United States joined the war. But why did they join? They did because they had to respond to the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. It wasn't long before the Allies took control of the situation and changed the tides after smashing over Europe in the first 3 years of the war. The outstretched Axis forces were forced on the defensive after being repulsed by the Soviet Red Army in the grueling Battle of Stalingrad, which lasted from August 1942 to February 1943. The ferocious fight for the city named after the Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin ended in roughly 2 million deaths, including the loss of tens of thousands of Stalingrad citizens. In 1943, the Allies started to swing the momentum against the Nazis and their associates throughout Europe. The Western Allies invaded Sicily and southern Italy in July 1943, which led to the overthrow of Italian dictator Benito Mussolini's administration and timed with the onset of Soviet army advances on the Eastern Front. After that, on June 6, 1944, the Allies began operations on a Western Front with the naval invasion of Normandy, known as D-Day. After establishing a footing in northern France, Allied soldiers freed Paris on August 25th, followed by Brussels a little under 2 weeks later. As Soviet soldiers marched into Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Romania, and Western Allied troops kept pressing eastward, Germany found itself trapped, or more precisely, squeezed between 2 opposing fronts. Hitler's resources continued to dwindle, and he was forced to fight a war on 2 fronts. He became more desperate and ordered a last-ditch attack on the Western Front in the hopes of dividing the lines held by the Allies. On December 16, 1944, the Nazis staged an ambush in a highly wooded stretch of the Ardennes forest that was around 80 miles long. The attack by the Germans forced the Allied line to bulge, but it did not break throughout the 6 weeks of battle, that too in conditions that were below freezing, and led men to suffer from hypothermia, frostbite, and trench foot. In what turned out to be their single bloodiest engagement of World War I, American troops were able to withstand the full might of what Germany had, but it wasn't free, of course. they suffered a loss of nearly 20,000 soldiers. What would become famous as the Battle of the Bulge would turn out to be Germany's last-ditch effort as the Soviet Red Army mounted a winter assault on the Eastern Front that would have them at the Oder River by the spring, less than 50 miles from Berlin, the capital of Germany. Following the destruction of Dresden and other German cities by firebombing, the Western Allies advanced eastward toward Berlin after crossing the Rhine River. As they got closer to the capital, Allied soldiers learned the horror of the Holocaust as they liberated prison camps in Bergen-Belsen and Dachau. These camps had been used to house Jews who had been sent there during the Holocaust. On April 30, 1945, with both fronts falling and defeat looming, Hitler shot himself in his bunker deep under the Reich Chancellery. Soon after, Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, who replaced Hitler, began peace talks, and on May 7, 1945, ordered General Alfred Jodl to sign an unconditional surrender of all German troops to take effect the next day. Stalin, however, refused to accept the terms of the surrender deal that had been signed at the headquarters of United States General Dwight D. Eisenhower in Reims, France. Instead, he had the Germans sign a new agreement the next day in Soviet-occupied Berlin. That marked the end of the war in Europe. Yet despite the fact that the Allies were victorious in Europe, World War II was still going strong in the Pacific Theater. After the victory at the Battle of Midway in June 1942, which turned the tide of the war in the Allies' favor, the Allied soldiers advanced on Japan's frontiers slowly but consistently. The battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa in the winter and spring of 1945 were among the deadliest of the war, and the American military forecast that any assault of the Japanese mainland would result in up to 1 million deaths. Weeks after the first successful test of the atomic bomb cropped in Alamogordo, New Mexico, on July 16, 1945, President Harry Truman, who had moved up to the presidential term less than 4 months earlier after the death of Franklin D. Roosevelt, licensed its use against Japan in the hopes of bringing a swift end to the war. 3 weeks later, infamous American B-29 bomber, nicknamed the Enola Gay, dropped an atomic bomb on the city of Hiroshima that instantly resulted in the deaths of over 80,000 people. Later, the effects of radiation exposure claimed the lives of tens of thousands. But Japan would not surrender, even after the bombing of Hiroshima. So the United States dropped an even more powerful atomic bomb on Nagasaki 3 days later. This explosion caused the deaths of 35,000 people instantly, and another 50,000 people died at the hands of the bomb's aftermath. Besides the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Soviet Union had also declared war on August 8 and attacked Japanese-occupied Manchuria in northeastern China, putting Japan under even greater strain. Emperor Hirohito of Japan broke the gridlock that was held among his imperial council and made the decision that his nation would have to surrender. So in his very first radio broadcast, the Japanese emperor made the announcement of Japan's surrender at 12 o'clock midday on August 15, 1945. On September 2nd, General Douglas MacArthur of the United States received Japan's official surrender aboard the United States battleship Missouri, which was docked in Tokyo Bay, together with a fleet of more than 250 Allied warships. This event marked the end of World War II. The signing of the agreement put an end to a worldwide war that had lasted 2,194 days. In a radio address, General Douglas MacArthur said to the world, "Today the guns are silent. A great tragedy has ended. A great victory has been won." war ended on every front. However, the resumption of hostilities in the rubric of the Cold War was just a matter of time. That is a narrative for next time.